In this video, we're going to begin teaching you about sensitivity analysis in Excel. So what do we mean by sensitivity analysis? Well, you might think it means that you're a sensitive person. In other words, you cry at chick flicks. Okay, you really have concern for other people, but that's not what sensitivity analysis in Excel means. To see what sensitivity analysis in Excel means, let's look at the following spreadsheet in the file Lemonade Temp. Very simple spreadsheet. Let's suppose you can open up a Starbucks. You're going to charge $4 for a cup of coffee. And your annual demand for a coffee will change as the price changes. Suppose you can sell 65,000 minus 9,000 times the price cups of coffee per year. Now, later on in our videos, we'll talk about pricing and how you can model a demand curve or estimate it, because that's quite important in trying to come up with the price that maximizes profit. But for now, just assume every time Starbucks raises the price at a little coffee stand, $1, they will sell 9,000 less cups of coffee per year. The unit cost of a cup of coffee, let's suppose, is 45 cents. The fixed cost of running the little Starbucks, let's say, kiosk at the airport is 45,000. Now, what's in red here are inputs. So every spreadsheet has inputs or assumptions. And then there are outputs, like revenue. What is revenue? Demand times price. What is variable cost? Unit cost times demand. And what is profit per year? Revenue minus fixed cost minus variable cost. So we have our inputs in red and our outputs in yellow. Okay, so in the next few videos, we're going to learn about Excel data tables, which are probably the best tool Excel has for sensitivity analysis. Now here we're going to learn about a one-way data table. So what does that mean? A one-way data table, you change one input. We will focus on changing the input of price. And look at the effect on multiple outputs. See, that's what sensitivity analysis is. Sensitivity analysis is seeing how changes in a model input and a model's inputs affect outputs. And why is this important? Because your assumptions on inputs are probably going to be wrong. Okay, like you may not want to charge a price of $4. If you have an assumption sales will go up 10% a year, like we had something like that in a previous video, well, they may not go up 10% a year. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, so we want to know if our assumptions are wrong, what's going to happen to our outputs to help us make better decisions. So how do you set up a one-way data table? You pick the input. In this case, it's price. You list values of the input that you think are relevant going down a column. So the current price is $4. So suppose we want to look at prices of $1.50, $1.75, and basically I'll select these two, and then Excel learns the pattern, and we'll just stop at $4. We could go higher. So you list the values of the input going down. Now you have what's called outputs. What are you interested in seeing the effect of the change in the input on? What formulas? Well, revenue, variable cost, and profit. So you go up one row and over one column. And you point to the formula. Don't type the value. So you put revenue. You do equals variable cost. And I'll put equals profit. Now, I'm going to label these. I don't need to, but it just makes it easier. And so what's going to happen when we're done with our data table? For example, what would go in this cell? What would go in this cell would be if we charge $2.25, what's the variable cost? What would go in this cell if I charge $1.75, what's the profit? Okay, so in other words, the data table tells us how sensitive each of those outputs is to changes in the inputs. Okay, so you list the value of the input going down a column. And you go up one row, over one column, point to the output formulas. In this case, revenue, variable cost, and profit. Okay. Then select the table range. Now the table range includes the inputs, the output formulas, and where the values of the outputs go. So this is the table range. Okay. And so then we're going to do from the data tab, what if analysis, and we'll select data table. We'll cover the other things there, goal sequence scenario manager shortly. Okay, and then in a one-way table, you'll see a box for row and column input cell. There's no row input cell. We'll get to the row input cell later. But the column input cell is where the column inputs get placed. In other words, these prices are the numbers in the first column are prices. You have to tell Excel they go in D1. Then Excel spits 1.5 in D1, does the formulas. Excel spits 1.75 in D1, does the formulas. Okay, then the output formulas are recalculated. Output formulas are calculated for each input value. Okay, so let's get it done. And then next video we'll talk about two-way tables. So you come here, you do control, you go over to the last output, go down to the last input, you go data, what if analysis, data table. Now there's no row input cell. The column input cell is B1. You just point to it. So now D1, sorry. It's going to put 1.5 in D1, compute the formulas, etc. Now your numbers may turn out to be all the same. I'll talk about that in a second. And then you hit the F9 key to change them. Okay, my numbers were different, but this, for example, says if I charge $225, here's my variable cost. If I charge $175, there's my profit. And you can see that my profit goes up to $3.75, but then it goes down. The highest profit is earned for these prices at $3.75. Okay, now if you look inside a data table, try and delete part of the data table. Even Superman couldn't delete it. It's got like kryptonite around it. That last Superman movie was really bad, by the way, I thought. Okay, so, but if you look in the data table, you'll see what your inputs were. See, it says table, the comma means before the comma there's nothing, no row input cell. After the comma there's D1, that's your column input cell. But you can't delete part of the table. Now you could, if you want to just make it numbers, you can select the data, do right-click copy, right-click paste special values. We'll talk about that in a later video, but that's usually not a good idea. But there are certain calculation options in Excel you should be aware of. So if you go to the Formulas tab, okay, you'll see calculation options. Now, automatic is your usual. Everything changes when you enter stuff in the spreadsheet. That's why it's called automatic. And then manual, you need to hit F9 key for the spreadsheet to recalculate. And you use this for big spreadsheets because you have a 100,000 row spreadsheet, things may go really slow. And you don't want to wait for the spreadsheet to recalculate every time you type somebody's name in. So you hit the F9 key for it to recalculate. And the final option, which is probably new to most of you, is automatic except for data tables. Now this is good for big spreadsheets. And so as you enter stuff in the spreadsheet, everything recalculates except the data tables, because they can be slow. And then you have to hit F9 to make the data tables recalculate. So if the data tables ever show that always the same, hit F9, that should change. But what we've seen is how to change a single input, look at the effect on as many outputs as we want. And that's a form of sensitivity analysis, which is very useful. You could do as many of these one-way tables as you want in a spreadsheet, and we'll talk about how to do a two-way data table where we change two inputs in the next video. That will be our next topic.